The issues affecting you. Revealed, explained, discussed. Now on WGAL 8 in Focus.
Hello, I'm Susan Shapiro. Former President Donald Trump's second impeachment trial is set to start next week. The House of Representatives charged him with incitement of insurrection for his role in the deadly riots January 6th at the U.S. Capitol. Tonight, we'll hear from two political experts in the Susquehanna Valley on the historical significance of this trial and the likelihood of conviction as we bring impeachment in focus. I'm joined now by News 8 political analyst Dr. Terry Madonna. Thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
In terms of history, where does this impeachment of Donald Trump stand?
Well, there have been 21 impeachments that have taken place in the House. There have been 8 convictions in the Senate, the trial in the Senate. And there have been 3 individuals, and this has to be a separate vote in the Senate, in which, and that takes majority vote, 3 individuals, federal judges, were banned from holding an office of honor, trust, or profit in the federal government. That's a separate vote from the vote to convict in the Senate.
Interesting. How likely do you think it is that Donald Trump will be convicted?
Well, when they had to have to consider holding a trial in the Senate, only 5 Republicans crossed over and said, yes, let's hold the trial. 75 Republicans did not. And so you need 2/3 vote, that's 67 votes in the United States Senate to convict. And they would need 17 Republicans in order to move forward. They're just not going to get the 17 Republicans on the single charge against former President Donald J. Trump, which was inciting an insurrection. And that comes from his speech. That comes from the rally and the speech that he gave on January 6th, which then, of course, the rioting took place, the break-in the Capitol, the destruction that took place there. And so one charge, 67 votes, 17 Republicans would have to cross over. I just don't think there's any way that happens.
And many Republicans have already argued that it is unconstitutional to impeach the man who was already out of office.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Now, there is a case involving a former Secretary of War, William Belkamp. He was Ulysses S. Grant's Secretary of War. He was, by the way, he learned he was going to be impeached in the House. He rushed into Grant's office and handed his resignation in. So he technically wasn't in office when the House impeached him. And by the way, in the trial that took place in the Senate, he wasn't convicted. Now, there's something else that's very important. The Senate, let's say someone's found guilty in the Senate. The Senate can't impose a penalty such as you're going to prison for so long. You follow me? The only thing the Senate can do, actually, there are 2 things. One is to convict, which means bye-bye from the office that you're in. You're out of the office. In a separate vote, and that's majority vote, a separate vote by majority, the Senate can ban someone from holding an office of, as I said before, honor, trust, or profit. And 3 federal judges had that apply to them out of the impeachments and the convictions in the Senate. So if they don't, let's say they don't convict former President Donald Trump in the Senate, there's an argument about whether then by majority vote they could ban him from holding another office. Translation, goodbye as a presidential candidate in 2024, should he decide to run. But the bigger point here is simple. Most constitutional experts think you have to convict a person in the Senate, of the impeachment charge or charges before you can go to the second vote on barring a federal official from holding an office in the federal government.
Certainly an interesting constitutional conversation. Stay with us, Dr. Madonna. We'll continue our conversation about impeachment.
This is WGAL 8 in Focus. Coverage you can count on.
We continue our conversation with News 8 political analyst Dr. Terry Madonna. Again, thanks for being here. Dr. Madonna, we got a briefing from the Republicans. It appears they are going to argue to some extent about a fraudulent election, something the president has been talking about.
Yeah, I don't know where that goes, to be very candid with you. President Trump has argued widespread voter fraud, widespread corruption. You're exactly right. Now, he lost his original defense team because they believed that was not an argument that was relevant when we're talking about the charge of inciting an insurrection. His new team, however, of two lawyers, one of whom is a former Montgomery County,
Bruce Castor, right?
Yeah, he's a former district attorney and acting attorney general in the state. I think you're right. They are going to get in a bit to whether the election was fraudulent, widespread fraud. The problem with that is that that's not what the charge before the United States Senate can. It's inciting an insurrection based on that January 6th speech, as we talked about in the last segment. And so the fact of the matter is that I don't know where that argument goes, to be very candid with you. No court, the Trump campaign and others on Trump's political side of the aisle did what? Multiple lawsuits, and they were not successful in them. So I don't know where that argument would go. But you're exactly right. It's going to be made in the defense of Trump when it gets to trial in the Senate.
And of course, the Democrats are arguing if this doesn't rise to impeachment, then what does?
Yeah, well, what rises to impeachment is inciting an insurrection, because that's the charge. That's the charge. But if you go and you look at past impeachments, bribery has been, and perjury, and violating some law has been, basically behind many of these charges that have been made. And in some cases, it was taking money, federal officials taking money to do A, B, or C. Bribes, in other words, perjury. If we look at the past presidents, Bill Clinton was charged with perjury in a civil trial, among other things, but that was whether he lied in civil testimony dealing with, I'll put it this way, Monica Lewinsky, and we'll leave all of that alone. The other president impeached was Andrew Johnson, and the argument to impeach him rested on whether he violated a federal law known as the Tenure of Office Act. What happened in Congress was the Republicans in control of Congress passed a bill that said if a federal official was confirmed by the Senate, the president, before he can eliminate that, fire that person, has to get the Senate approval. And that's where Johnson went and fired an individual in his cabinet, and he was impeached on violating the Tenure of Office Act. The real problem, of course, was the difference that Republicans had in their Reconstruction plans after the Civil War, and Andrew Johnson, who was certainly not in favor of what the Republicans wanted to do. So at the heart of it, it was big differences in policy, if you will, but the Tenure of Office Act was the official charge, right? Reason for the impeachment in the House of Representatives. By the way, none of the two other presidents impeached, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, were convicted in the Senate.
Yeah. In terms of the Biden administration, how do you see this trial impacting the start of this new administration?
Well, it doesn't seem to. I don't think that President Biden was in favor of this. In fact, he hinted on a number of occasions. Hinting may be not strong enough, but he said, "Look, I want my cabinet officers confirmed. I want my $1.9 trillion stimulus bill approved. I don't want to get all caught up, have the federal government, the House and the Senate, get all caught up in impeachment and a Senate trial and not have my agenda dealt with." But his cabinet officers, but then he sort of backed away. Why? Because he needs obviously the Democrats in the House and the Senate to support his agenda, and he didn't want to get into a tiff with them. And you can certainly understand that. But it is going to move forward, and of course, President Biden has issued more than 40 executive orders and regulations. I think that's the most any president.
Yes, I think it's a record. Yeah.
It is a record.
Yeah, and that's another issue for discussion. And maybe the delay of the trial obviously helped the Biden administration get started. Thank you, Dr. Madonna, for your insights. We appreciate it. And coming up, a political science professor at Dickinson College will join us with his thoughts on the impeachment trial.
This is WGAL 8 in Focus, coverage you can count on.
I am joined now by Dr. David O'Connell, an associate political science professor at Dickinson College in Cumberland County. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on the program.
We're talking an impeachment trial. I know you're not a legal scholar, but in terms of an impeachment trial, how does that differ just basically from a criminal trial?
Well, I think one of the major differences is that President Trump or former President Trump doesn't actually have to have committed a crime to be convicted. It's entirely a political judgment on the part of the U.S. Congress, now in the trial phase in the Senate, as to whether or not he's guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. And so some of the charges that the Democrats made in their filing brief to begin the trial certainly are not in any way criminal acts. They're more improper acts that betrayed his duty to his office, as they see it.
And I guess the Democrats are arguing that his actions since the election in those couple of months were unacceptable behavior for a U.S. president, correct?
That's correct. The Democrats are not limiting themselves simply to the actions that President Trump took on January 6th, his appearance at a rally in D.C., where he urged attendees to fight like hell for their country. And then, of course, many of them marched to the Capitol and stormed into the building itself. The Democrats are also focusing on the 2 months from the election until that point, and President Trump's false assertions of election fraud, his contacting of government officials like Secretary of State in Georgia, urging them to find votes for him, and other ways that he tried to subvert the electoral result.
I guess it's somewhat of a judgment call as to what is proper behavior for a U.S. president.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that is the argument that President Trump is going to make in response. I would anticipate Trump making two arguments in his defense. One, of course, is questioning the constitutionality of even putting a president on trial after he has left office. But the other is really a free speech argument. It's a First Amendment argument, making the case that Trump legitimately believed that there had been election fraud and he has a right to express that opinion.
Does he have that right?
Well, I mean, I think he absolutely has that right, but I also feel that there has to be a commitment to truth and to the facts of the situation. And so as I look at President Trump's conduct after the election, I have no problem with the lawsuits that were filed. That is absolutely his right as a candidate. If he thinks that there was wrongdoing, that there were problems in the way the election was administered, there are procedures in place that allow him to take those matters before a judge and have a fair hearing. And he did that. But then ultimately, those suits were rejected. They were dismissed. He lost those cases. And it's clear at this point that, like every other presidential election in modern times, there is no meaningful evidence of electoral fraud. And so at that point, I think it is incumbent on him to accept the results of an election that didn't go his way. It's difficult to do so, but it's important for our democracy that when people lose, they acknowledge those losses.
But yet a lot of Republicans, including some in the Senate, went along with the president, saying they wanted to overturn the election results.
That's absolutely right. And it's unfortunate. I think some of those senators were making political calculations. Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, I think they feel that they can tap into Trump's support. And by beginning a defense of the president now, they're moving towards hopefully becoming the nominee in 2024. So I don't know how sincerely those Republicans in the House or Senate believed those charges versus whether or not they were simply political postures.
Yeah, hard to know, but obviously they are probably not going to vote to convict the president.
No. And that's one of the things that I think is a legitimate question about whether or not this trial is good for American democracy, because at the end of the day, there is simply no doubt that the votes to convict President Trump are not there. You only had 5 Republicans even willing to support the idea of having a trial in the first place, far short of the 17 that would be needed to convict him, and then allow the Democrats to take a vote that would bar him from running for office, holding office in the future. And so with the outcome already determined, you can ask whether or not there were better opportunities here for Congress to express its disapproval. I think that was important to do. What happened on January 6th was abhorrent. It was reprehensible. I think that Congress needs to go on the record establishing that that's the sense of the body. But they could have done that with a censure resolution.
Censure, yeah.
That would have had bipartisan support. Instead of a trial that is maybe of questionable constitutionality, that isn't going to accomplish anything, and in some ways may allow President Trump to claim vindication when he is acquitted.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, stay with us, Dr. O'Connell. We'll talk more about what this means for democracy and the Republican and Democratic parties going forward.
This is WGAL 8 in Focus. Coverage you can count on.
We continue our conversation with David O'Connell, an associate political science professor at Dickinson College in Cumberland County. And thanks again for being here, Dr. O'Connell. If obviously those Republicans who don't convict or vote to convict Donald Trump, are they in a sense endorsing his behavior?
Well, I think that will be to some extent a question of your own perception of those votes. But when people study Congress, they talk about how members of Congress explain their votes in this position-taking process. And so I think the way members of Congress will explain those votes, Republican members of Congress will explain those votes to convict, will be along the lines of making sure that they indicate that they oppose what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, not a controversial position, given that polls show 90% of Americans opposed what happened on January 6th, but then also making arguments along the lines of questioning the constitutionality of the trial, and also making an argument that this was a political movement by the Democrats that distracted Congress from what people really wanted them to be focusing on, which is coronavirus and economic relief.
But yet some Democrats will argue if this doesn't rise to the level of impeachment, what does?
That's true. And I think that argument might have been more persuasive to Republicans had the Democrats moved quicker. Nancy Pelosi initially said that they needed to move forward on impeachment because they could not tolerate one more day of Trump in office. And indeed, there was discussion about Trump's access to nuclear weapons and how he might start a military conflict and so forth. But then the Democrats took a week in the House before moving forward with impeachment. And of course, then the trial has been delayed weeks into this new session. So those arguments now fall a little flat, I feel. And if the Democrats had immediately moved to remove Trump from office after January 6th, I think they had a better chance of getting more Republican support. But time is a factor here.
And what about Donald Trump? We haven't heard from him quite as much, obviously, since he left office, and he doesn't have the Twitter platform. How do you think this will impact his hold on the Republican Party?
Well, I think that is absolutely an interesting observation, that he's been uncharacteristically silent. And to some extent, that might be a result of social media companies taking away his access to their platforms and no longer being able to directly communicate his thoughts through Twitter when he has them. But I also, based on what I'm seeing, feel that he's made a conscious decision that he's going to remain quiet until the trial is over and then emerge. And I think strategically that's the right decision. That if he acts in any type of a provocative way, it could tip some more Republicans towards voting to convict. And so I think he's making a strategic decision that he's going to hold back after the trial is over. Then I would expect him to emerge. But at the same time, I think we have to just step back and look at what the last 2 months have done to his political career in its entirety. I would have told you right after the election that Trump had an excellent chance of being the Republican nominee in 2024, even though his election performance was pretty much exactly what political scientists would have expected, given the fundamentals of the political environment, his approval rating, state of the economy, and so forth. The perception was that he had done better. That he increased the number of votes that he got from 2016, that he had made positive inroads into growing demographic groups like Hispanic voters, that he had started to move Florida more in a red direction instead of a swing state. All of these things, I think, would have allowed him to make a compelling argument that he would have won re-election were it not for the pandemic, and to remind people of 3 years of peace and prosperity, despite all the controversies that came with his administration. But now, the way he handled himself after the election and refusing to accept that loss, working to overturn it, participating in a rally that led to people dying in the Capitol, I think he's burned bridges with Republicans. Institutional Republicans who would not fund his campaign, would not support him. I think his chances of being the nominee are nil, and his political career is over. The best he can hope for is participating in rallies for candidates that he likes around the country, just as a way of getting that kind of attention.
Yeah, certainly we'll still have a voice. Well, we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you, Dr. O'Connell, for joining us. We really appreciate your perspective.
Thanks so much for having me.
The second impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump is set to begin Tuesday, February 9th. WGAL News 8 and NBC News will cover developments in the trial on air and online. Thank you for joining us for WGAL 8 in Focus. For all of us here at WGAL, I'm Susan Shapiro. And join us again next Saturday night at 7 o'clock for WGAL 8 in Focus after NBC Nightly News.